Picture this. It's January 1st, just before midnight. A woman sits alone at her kitchen table, paper in front of her, pen in hand. The house is quiet, an almost sacred quiet, and she's writing her resolutions. She feels powerful, clean. She can see the person she's about to become. 6 weeks later, she's eating leftover cake at 11 p.m., scrolling through her phone, wondering what happened to that certainty. This won't provide easy answers. What we're about to uncover is where the simplifications break down and take every New Year's promise we make crashing down with them. Because the calendar isn't changing you. It's changing what you believe about yourself. But here's what we never ask. What if that January 1st feeling, that surge of possibility, wasn't a moment of clarity at all? What if it was a carefully orchestrated psychological illusion? A theater of renewal that your mind stages every year, not despite its repeated failure, but because of it? The consensus tells us resolutions fail because of weak willpower, because we're lazy, because we lack discipline. But the data suggests something far stranger. Resolutions fail at precisely the rate that keeps us making them. The failure is the feature, and if that's true, then everything we think we understand about change, about January 1st, about the fresh start we promise ourselves, is fundamentally incomplete. Because what if the hidden reason resolutions collapse isn't psychological weakness, but psychological necessity? Here's what the research actually shows, and it's going to feel like vindication at first. The conventional story goes like this. New Year's resolutions are aspirational commitments we make to better ourselves. The research even validates their effectiveness. People who set goals on January 1st are 10 times more likely to maintain them after 6 months than those who start on a random Tuesday. This is called the fresh start effect. Temporal landmarks, the beginning of a week, a month, a year, even a birthday, create what behavioral economists call new periods of mental accounting. The mechanism appears straightforward. These markers psychologically separate us from our past failures. We relegate our imperfections to a closed chapter, a previous self we're no longer accountable to. January 1st offers a clean ledger. We feel superior to who we were. The future seems tractable, but here's the fracture in that story. If the fresh start effect is real, if temporal landmarks genuinely enhance our capacity for change, why does the absolute failure rate remain catastrophically high? Why do roughly 88% of resolutions collapse within weeks? The standard answer, lack of willpower, now sounds less like an explanation and more like an evasion, a way to avoid asking the more unsettling question. Here's where it becomes more complex. Let me show you what's actually happening in the brain when a resolution falls apart. Consider a man who resolves to quit smoking. On January 1st, he doesn't just throw away his cigarettes, he performs a small ceremony. He snaps them in half. There's intention in the gesture. And for the first 3 weeks he holds, his lungs feel cleaner. He tells friends, "This time it's different." Then one evening, after a stressful work call, sitting alone in his car with the engine running, a colleague offers him a cigarette. He takes it, and in that moment, something remarkable happens inside his brain. One part of him knows this breaks the chain. This undoes 3 weeks of new neural pathways. But another part, older, faster, more efficient, simply wants the relief, wants to soothe the activated stress response. And that older part wins. By the next day, he's back to a pack. What happened? The neuroscience tells us something unexpected. His brain didn't just forget the new habit. The old neural pathway, the one that linked stress to cigarettes, never disappeared. It was merely temporarily suppressed. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself, operates on a principle that sounds almost Darwinian. Neural maps are competitive. Every habit, every thought pattern competes for territory in your brain. And here's the paradox Norman Doidge identified. The same plasticity that allows you to change also allows you to become rigid. The well-worn path, stress equals cigarette, is faster, more efficient. When attention wavers, the old circuit reasserts dominance. But this isn't just neurobiology. William James observed over a century ago that the person who makes a new resolution every day is like someone who reaches the edge of a ditch to jump, stops, runs back for momentum, stops again, and never makes the leap. Resolutions that exist only in mental space, he warned, actively work against future attempts. Not neutral, not harmless. They obstruct. So the fresh start effect gives us the impulse to change, but it also guarantees we'll need it again next year. Now here's the kicker, and this is where psychology collides with history in a way that will make you rethink everything about that clean slate we crave. The ancient Romans chose January to begin the year in honor of Janus, a god with two faces, one looking backward, one forward. This wasn't arbitrary symbolism. Janus embodied the psychological capacity the Romans intuited was necessary for transition. Retrospective consciousness fused with prospective imagination. You cannot step into the future without integrating what came before. But our resolutions rarely do this integration. Instead, they perform what Freud would recognize as a kind of psychological split, severing the continuity that durable change requires. And here's the problem. This split, while motivating in the short term, fractures identity itself. Worse, many resolutions emerge not from authentic desire, but from what Freud called the superego, the internalized voice of moral authority. Picture a woman who resolves to exercise daily, not because movement brings her joy, but because she feels guilty about her body. Her resolution is a promise to satisfy a punitive inner judge. When she inevitably fails, because the standard is unrealistic, because her nervous system rebels against tyranny, the guilt doesn't dissipate, it intensifies. And guilt, paradoxically, drives her back to the very behavior she's trying to escape. She eats to soothe the shame of not exercising, which generates more shame, which requires more soothing. The cycle is self-perpetuating. This is what I mean. Resolutions aren't structured to fail. They are shaped by psychological incentives, where the ritual of renewal matters more than the process of change. The resolution doesn't need to succeed. It needs to recur. Hold on. Let us sit with the discomfort of that for a moment. What does that imply about us? Are we masochists? Are we trapped in some collective delusion? But here's the truth we're all avoiding. We're not naive about this. We know at some level that next January 1st will probably fail again. Many of us have failed before, multiple times, and we make resolutions anyway. That's not weakness. That's not stupidity. That's something else entirely. To understand what it is, we have to look at how cultures handle transition. The anthropologist Victor Turner described rituals of transition, rites of passage, as having three phases: separation, liminality, and aggregation. The new year sits in the liminal space, the threshold, the betwixt and between. In that ambiguous zone, the old structures are suspended, but the new haven't solidified. It's a moment of pure potentiality and unsettling, because in liminality, you are invisible, undefined, neither who you were nor who you'll become. Resolutions are our attempt to ritualize that terror, to give it form. We need the ceremony of the fresh start, not because it works, but because the alternative is to confront the continuity of who we are without the shelter of symbolic rebirth. We would have to admit that change is not a singular event triggered by a date on a calendar, that it is gradual, invisible, unglamorous, that it happens in the unremarkable repetition of small actions, none of which feel heroic in the moment, and perhaps most unbearably, that we might have to stop waging war against ourselves. That acceptance, not revolution, is what transformation requires. Here is what nobody tells you about transformation, and this is where ancient mythology becomes uncomfortably relevant to your gym membership. Osiris, Dionysus, Adonis, figures from ancient mystery religions who died and were resurrected. Carl Jung saw these myths not as literal biographies, but as psychological templates. The god doesn't die because he's weak. He dies because death is the precondition for rebirth. The ego, the conscious self with all its limitations, must be sacrificed to allow the emergence of the self, the fuller totality of who you are. But here's the tension. Symbolic death is not actual annihilation. You don't erase who you were, you integrate the rejected parts. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow, everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself. The compulsive eater doesn't overcome their behavior by rejecting hunger or comfort. They transform by understanding what hunger is feeding besides the body, what void it's filling, what terror it's soothing. The New Year's resolution, then, is a diluted version of this ancient initiatory process. It gestures toward death and rebirth, but it rarely completes the journey, because completion would require us to stay in the discomfort long enough to metabolize it, to let the old neural pathways weaken not through force, but through the patient, focused attention William James and modern neuroscience both insist is necessary. And that process, it's not photogenic. It doesn't resolve in a week or fit neatly into online formats. So we settle for the theater, the annual performance, knowing at some level we'll be back next year. So here's what changes when you see it clearly. When you stop pretending January 1st is magic and start recognizing it for what it actually is. Let's return to that woman at her kitchen table on January 1st, writing her resolutions, feeling powerful. What if instead of dismissing her as naive, we recognize what she's actually doing? She's participating in a 4,000-year-old ritual. The Babylonians did this during the Akitu festival, reaffirming cosmic order. The Romans did it under the gaze of Janus. We do it with gym memberships and meal plans. The ritual persists not because it solves a problem, but because it addresses a deeper need. The need to mark time, to contain the terror of our own continuity, to believe, if only for a moment, that we are not doomed to repeat ourselves forever. That need is not a weakness, it's profoundly human. But here's the key insight. Recognizing the ritual for what it is doesn't mean abandoning it. It means engaging it differently. Not as a magic bullet, not as a battle against who you are, but as an invitation to pay attention. The kind of focused, patient attention that actually rewires the brain. To notice where your guilt speaks louder than your desire. To ask what you're trying to kill that might need integration instead. A resolution isn't a reinvention. It's a rehearsal for attention. And that's where transformation begins. The books and research studies that inform this reflection are linked in the description below. This video is part of the Psychology of Being Human playlist, where we take these questions seriously, even when the answers resist easy resolution. Now, new videos every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Because at Tender Reason, we don't just make promises, we examine the mind that makes them.